Hey YouTube, how's it going? Kevin Cleary with a discussion video today about blade grinds. It is going to be a knife video. What I'd like to ask you guys before we get started is I'd love to hear in the comments what blade shapes you particularly feel drawn to and which ones you really don't like, if you feel strongly about that at all. Maybe you're a little more open-minded and you really have no strong preferences along those lines, and that's fine too. But as you know, I often express my preference for a hollow ground blade, okay? And I want to talk a little bit about blade grinds, why I like a hollow grind, and why, you know, sometimes there are some legitimate reasons I would suggest for not doing a hollow grind, although often I feel they're a little bit questionable. I'll kind of bring that up as we go through. But let me start, now that I've asked you what I'd love to hear in the comments, let me start by pointing this out. Number one, most knives in most situations are going to work fine. Okay, it doesn't matter if it's a high hollow grind, a low hollow grind, or a mid spine grind, a saber grind. Doesn't matter if it's a full flat grind or a partial flat grind. Whether it's got a micro bevel or doesn't have a micro bevel, whatever. Most of the time, if you have given any care at all to your knives, or if they're new, fresh from the factory, they're going to cut at least somewhat for the box you have to cut up or the piece of rope you have to cut. Okay, and all of us have probably had to demonstrate in our own lives that even a dull knife will work if you really have to make it work. It's not pleasant. Sometimes it can even be dangerous, but a lot of times you can kind of work it out. Okay, so let's kind of put that out there at the first. So I don't want you to perceive the comments that I'm making today as being totally against a particular blade grind. I have knives that represent all kinds of different blade grinds, and I would recommend all of them. So let's do that for a second. Here's the Ultimate Hunter. It's a flat ground blade, and it's not even a high flat grind. Okay, there's still quite a bit of flat up here. Great knife, totally love it. Here is a higher flat grind on the ZT-804. Again, very good knife. Definitely a higher grind than the knife we just saw, but both of them perform well, and I really like both. Here we have two knives that I find to be similar. I've actually compared these two. This one has a hollow grind, this one has a flat grind. Again, I like them both. They both work well, although I will say I prefer the hollow grind in that situation. Here's another very nice knife, this time a flat ground blade. Okay, let's throw in a couple more cold steels here. Recon 1, clip point, hollow grind. American Lawman is a great example of a very high hollow grind, and I love the grind on this blade. It is phenomenal. Let's see, here's a Strider. This one you've seen before, at least I think if you watched yesterday's video you did. This has a hollow grind as well, and often these are not hollow grind, and often these are flat ground. So there you go. There's a few different blades, a few different shapes. And I say that to say, look, all of these are good knives. All of them cut well. I'm not suggesting that certain grinds are just terrible or useless or anything like that. Okay, I do have a preference, and I am going to explain that a little bit for you as we kind of go along. Before we get into those grinds, what they are and what the implications of each one are going to be, let me say this. There are knives that are designed for a specific purpose. Okay, a butcher knife only has to be in a butcher shop. It doesn't need to do anything else. A cleaver, again, only needs to be in a butcher shop or a kitchen. Doesn't need to do anything else but cleave, usually chop joints and stuff. A hatchet is only going to chop, okay? It doesn't need to do much anything else. So there are knives that are designed for a specific purpose. A saw, okay, it's a cutting tool designed for a specific purpose. So we can't hold those kind of knives to the same standard or ask them to do the same things that we normally ask from our everyday carry knives or even our bushcrafting knives. Okay, and I'm one that feels like a bushcraft knife should be versatile as well. Sometimes people will carry a bushcraft, one for chopping and one for slicing, often a Scandi grind on the slicer and a fairly thick flat grind on the chopper. I don't know. To me, I feel like it's possible, and there's high quality steel that you could easily do a fairly large chopping knife that still had a hollow grind and a decent edge. And the reason I know that is because knives like the BK9 or the SE6, they do chop and slice fairly well. Okay, now the SC is not a great chopper because it's just not heavy enough, but the BK9 for sure can chop like crazy and still slice and whittle and do all that stuff very well also. So I don't believe that in a bushcraft knife you need to pick one or the other. Sorry guys, hopefully you got a coffee too. This might be a bit of a longer discussion. I'll try to keep it brief, but I may have to expand a little. Now, I'm going to try not to mess up the lighting. The paper may do that. I'm going to try to, yeah, see, it's already, my face is getting darker. That's okay. Bear with me on this. So these are to represent different grinds, okay? This is a full flat grind in a fairly thick grind. You can see how this triangle is fairly wide. This is supposed to be a similar blade, only in this case it's hollow ground instead. This is supposed to be a full flat grind. That's a fairly slim full flat grind. Here is supposed to be a fairly thick partial hollow grind and a partial flat grind. Okay, now if you're slicing, yes, let's imagine that you wanted to cut through this pen. Okay, I think you can see fairly readily that these three in the middle are going to perform the best. Okay, a fairly thin flat grind or a hollow grind. Okay, because these two, even though you got a lot of material up here, right behind the edge, they're still going to slice pretty well. Okay, so that essentially explains why I'd rather see a hollow grind, even in like a tough, durable, whatever, you know, take everything, you know, it's a 1/4 inch thick blade stock and all of this. I'd much prefer a hollow grind because this is to represent a thick blade, but notice how with that very thick stock you can still get a fairly thin edge and therefore a knife that will actually cut stuff pretty well. So this diagram essentially explains what I'm trying to say here. Now notice, if you want to move away from that, you can go to a full flat grind or a high flat grind and do a pretty good job. In fact, you could even, you know, there would be a happy medium between this very thick blade and this very thin blade. And I think knives like this, the Ultimate Hunter, do strike that kind of medium balance, where this is thicker than, say, this here would represent, but it's certainly not as thick as this and not as difficult and unwieldy as that. And I have had knives that are so thick that they're difficult to do anything with. Another good example of that I just had in my hand, there we go. The Riot knives, the Torrent is another example of a grind that it's not this, it's sort of somewhere in between. Okay, so it is a flat grind, but it is fairly thin behind the edge and cuts pretty well. So hopefully that explains my preference for a hollow grind. You see how even with very thick blade stock you can still get good edge geometry. Now let me take one step further and point out, when we talk about blade shapes, I think there's more preference involved in that, with the exception of some of the blade shapes that I'll talk about. So here are some different blade shapes. Hopefully you can see what I'm trying to represent here. I'm not trying to be a knife designer or make these the most beautiful drawings you've ever seen, but this is supposed to be a drop point where there's just a gentle drop toward the tip. That's a clip point. That's a spear point. Now, what I want to point out about these is this. All of these three designs could actually be achieved with no change to the actual cutting edge. Okay, so let's see. These two knives I think work well to make this point. Okay, these two cutting edges are not that dissimilar. Okay, I know there is a little more belly on this one. Okay, but you could actually make this knife a clip point just by making a little cut here. So instead of this gentle slope, if you just made a straight cut right there, you know, sort of took this portion off, this would now be a clip point, and the actual cutting edge would not have changed at all. All right, and you could do something very close to that with a spear point as well. So here's an example. This knife is almost a spear point, right? If this was just a little further down, like around here, this would be a spear point blade shape. And so what I would suggest about those particular variations is that they're really amount to preference. Okay, there's not a lot of difference in many cases in the actual cutting performance of those various different blade shapes. Now there are blades that are designed more to pierce, but if you remember the time a while back when I did the tire puncture test, I used a bunch of different blade shapes, and they all punctured that tire rubber really easily. And that rubber is a lot tougher than your skin, okay? So needing a knife to pierce, almost any knife will do it. Now there are exceptions, okay? So I've got a Tanto, a sheep's foot, and a Wharncliffe here. These are obviously much different, and what I've been saying won't apply to those. These are quite different, and they're going to have to be used differently. Now I would suggest that they're not quite as versatile. These three blade shapes, you can pretty well get them to do everything. Yeah, sometimes that very, very sharp point on a Wharncliffe is helpful for opening packages or a particular job that you might have to do. You know, if you're a surgeon and you're performing surgery, well, that requires a certain blade shape. And a scalpel has a particular grind that's for doing surgery. So that's my discussion on blade shapes. I like different blade shapes, but I think you have to realize when it comes to blade shape, whether it's a clip point or a spear point or a drop point, or you know, a Persian style or a standard straight back, whatever, these are all largely matters of preference. We don't really get into measurable differences until we start looking at the cutting edge. And that's the last portion of this discussion that I want to get into. Let me see if I can find my diagram for that. I do have one. Okay, now this part pertains more to sharpening, but it is a consideration when buying a knife initially. So I have some secondary bevels here. Somewhere here, oh yeah, this one down here is meant to represent a micro bevel. But here is how a lot of knives come, and I'm exaggerating this, okay, to make a point. So this is like a full flat grind. It could also be a hollow grind if we just did. See if I can demonstrate a hollow grind without totally messing this up. Okay, so this is meant to be a hollow grind. There we go. The dotted lines are to represent a hollow grind. You can see how it does result in less material at the edge. Okay, so this is not the primary bevel. So this is the primary bevel. This is the secondary bevel, the sharpened edge. Okay, right here. I know my face is black. That's okay. I want you to pay attention to the paper anyway. Notice how this one is very wide. Okay, the angle on that is a very open angle. This one is much narrower, all right? This one is going to do 95% of cutting tasks, actually 100, any cutting task, this is going to do better. The only thing better about this one is it's more stable, but it's also going to get dull faster, okay? So you're going to be less likely to damage your blade if it's like this, and that's why some companies will send knives out like that. Okay, that kind of a blade where it's a really obtuse angle, yes, it's very stable. It may be on a blade that you're going to be chopping with, on a blade that's claiming to be hard use. I got to tell you, Striders, when they come from the factory, the blade angle is horrible as far as I'm concerned. They're not meant to cut anything, okay? And it's really, really annoying. And I've had a few other knives like that as well. Now, what you can do is reprofile those, lay them back to a steeper angle so they'll cut better. And I've had other knives. Lion steel is another one. Rat knives tend to have a fairly obtuse angle. A number of sort of hard-use bushcraft knives, they think that by putting this obtuse angle on, they're making it more durable. And in some ways they are, but you're also making it so it's not going to cut anything, which then why bother? You could have just sent me a steel ingot and it would have been just as useful, you know? So that's why. So that's how the secondary bevel works. Now you can get some of that stability back. If you take this and go over here, you can do a micro bevel, and I've talked about a micro bevel before, but that's essentially, you know, you take, here's your grind, and then there's your sharpened edge, and you actually add another sharpened edge to that for stability and for longevity. Okay, and I think that I do that with a lot of my knives, and I think it's worthwhile. I tell you that part because it sometimes becomes helpful if you've bought a knife and you can't figure out why it doesn't cut well, to reprofile it or have someone else reprofile it for you so that it now has a grind a secondary bevel, I'm sorry, that's more like this, okay? You're not going to change the grind yourself. Now, if you're familiar with Will Moon, one of the really cool things he does, if you can send him your Hinder or XM18 or I suppose XM24 or Eclipse or whatever else, he will regrind the blade so that it actually has a thinner grind, and he does put a hollow grind on them, which is awesome. So he takes a knife, which is already a pretty good knife, and he regrinds the blade to make it extremely slicey. And that is really cool, and I really love what he's doing. I'm not so sure if Rick Hinder loves what he's doing, but it's a really neat service. Take a knife that's already a great knife, no question. I would not argue that Hinder is a great knife. It really is. But then Will Moon is improving them in my mind by making that edge grind, making that blade grind more capable of slicing tasks. Okay, so when I talk about this, what I prefer and what I recommend are knives that have a fairly good secondary bevel around 20 degrees. That's what the Sharpmaker is. They pick that angle because it's very common and because it cuts well, okay? If a knife has that already, hey, great. If you need a knife reprofile, there are lots of guys out there who can do that. If you ever needed a recommendation, you could, if you have no idea and you just found this video out of the blue, probably most of you already know probably 5 guys who reprofile and do work on blades. If you're not in that boat and you need a recommendation, feel free to send me a personal message or whatever, even comment on this video. And in the comments, I'm sure there'd be guys who could tell you, hey, this is a good place to look, or that's a good place to look for someone to reprofile a blade for you. You can avoid, in the first place, certain knives that have a really obtuse angle. And if you pay attention to YouTube reviewers, a lot of them will comment on that. I'll tell you a really famous one, Benchmade. Their secondary bevels are often not great, okay? They aren't. And so I've heard tons of guys in reviews, and myself included, complain about the edge that comes on a Benchmade and how they either have to reprofile it or send it back to Benchmade for sharpening, and it can be a pain in the neck. So that's the only thing I would try to avoid are really thick blades where they're so thick behind the edge they don't cut well, or extremely obtuse secondary bevels that again are not going to cut as well. When I recommend, if you're doing your own sharpening, I would recommend doing, laying those edges back a little bit or sending them to have someone else lay them back a little bit, and I do put a small micro bevel on, which takes away a little bit of the slicing ability, but does add to the longevity of that edge. Okay, so there you go, guys. That's my discussion of blade shapes, blade grinds, and bevels. Hope it was helpful to you. I'd love to hear your comments below about what you like and what you dislike. We'll talk to you soon.